Number 8. The Peter Iredale. Visitors to the northern part of Oregon's Pacific coast have been able to witness an aging shipwreck rot for over 100 years. The Peter Iredale, a 275-foot steel-hulled sailing ship, was making its way towards the coast in the early hours of October 1906 when the captain, H. Lawrence, spotted the Tillamook Rock lighthouse. Using it as a guide, the captain tried to maneuver the ship through the dangerous mouth of the Columbia River, which had been known as a very treacherous area to sailors, even garnering the nickname of the Graveyard of the Pacific. As the captain approached in search of a pilot schooner that would help him navigate, Lawrence found no such guide, as in fact, the schooner was in the port undergoing repairs instead. As the wind rose and the tide advanced, Lawrence battled the elements, but a gale set the ship crashing into the jetty, immediately snapping 3 of the ship's 4 masts from the impact. Although no one on board was injured, the ship took damage to its hull. Initially thought to be just minor damage, the plan was to tow the Peter Iredale back out to sea. But over the next few weeks, as the crew waited for the weather to get better, the ship started to lean to its side, becoming embedded in the sand, making it nearly impossible to move. As the ship sat there, stuck and unable to be rescued, it was sadly sold for scrap. Anything not removed was simply left to rot and rust away, where it still stands to this day, now a popular attraction for visitors who want to catch a glimpse of the rusted steel hull before it disintegrates for good. Number 7. The Sugar Ship. More than 40 years after a vicious storm overtook a Greek cargo vessel, the ship remains left to rust on Scotland's west coast. In January 1974, the MV Captayanus was moored on the River Clyde with the hull filled with raw East African sugar. Waiting to unload its cargo, the ship was lashed by 60 mph winds, dragging the ship's anchor across the river bottom and causing it to drift. As the captain ordered his crew to start the engines in effort to head for the shelter of nearby Gairloch, the ship drifted into the anchor chains of a nearby tanker. The impact tore a hole in the hull of the Captayanus, flooding the hull and forcing the captain to try to save the ship and his crew by heading for a local sandbar. Luckily, he saved his entire crew, but the ship ran aground. Through the night, a small flotilla of tugboats tried to help the ship by preventing it from drifting further. Unfortunately, the ship began to lean to one side. The crew were able to jump onto rescue boats, but by the following morning, the ship had keeled over and it never sailed again. Because the ship is so close to a local bird sanctuary, it has been left intact, and now the birds have made it their home, along with fish, who have also made it a place to colonize in its empty hatches. Although it has been stripped for parts, much of the ship's skeleton remains, and it lingers there in the loch, the sugar boat that remains a part of the Clyde landscape. Some would say that it's eerily beautiful. Number 6. SS Kakapo. South Africa's Long Beach is a stunning, white sand paradise. It is also the home to the skeleton of a ship that wrecked there in 1900. One of the many ships that fell victim to South Africa's rocky shoreline, the SS Kakapo, was a 665-ton schooner rigged steamship that fell victim to the characteristic fog, strong currents, and inhospitable cliffs that have taken 360 ships in the Table Bay area alone. On its way from the UK to Sydney with a cargo of coal, the SS Kakapo ran aground in the Cape of Storms, being whipped by a massive gale that impaired the visibility of the ship's crew. The ship ended up on the beach after mistaking Chapman's Peak for Cape Point. Although none of the crew were injured, the ship became trapped in the sandy shore. Legend has it that after the mishap, the captain was so mortified by his mistake that he refused to leave the ship and lived there for as long as 3 years. Built in 1898 and named after a type of parrot from New Zealand, the SS Kakapo remains where it came to rest. 120 years later, the sand, wind, and waves have worn away much of its exterior, with only the hull and boiler still visible. Have you ever seen a shipwreck up close in real life? Where was it? What was it? Tell me about your experience in the comments below. Then remember to subscribe to American Eye if you haven't already for more intense videos just like this one. Number 5. Edward Bolen. The SS Kakapo isn't the only ship to fall victim to the conditions of South Africa's coast. The beauty of the white sand beaches can't be denied, but neither can the sometimes dangerous conditions of the surrounding waters, where many ships remain after wrecking. Tourists can even travel what is known as the Shipwreck Trail to view the Cape of the Storms, where multiple rusted and rotting hulls remain. One of the most well-known wrecks is that of the Edward Bolen. The reason it gets so much attention over the other wrecks is its location. It appears stranded in the middle of the desert. A German cargo ship that ran aground went on its way to Table Bay. The ship now lies about a quarter mile from the shoreline. Overtaken by sand, the ship ran into trouble in 1909 due to the thick fog that resulted in the ship losing its way and running around at Conception Bay. Now partially buried, it has become one of the most photographed wrecks for the stark contrast in its rusted hull and its location offshore instead of submerged in the water like most wrecks. The Skeleton Coast certainly lives up to its name, with so many storied shipwrecks lost to the conditions and now left as a reminder of the danger of the world's oceans. Let's just say I wouldn't go for a boating trip there if I weren't with a really experienced sailor or two. Number 4. HMVS CERBERUS. A breakwater ship that served as part of the Victorian Naval Forces in Australia, the HMVS CERBERUS rests off the coast as a rusting scrap almost 90 years after it was last set sail. With its central armored structure that contained elevated gun turrets and a bridge, the ship was built to withstand breaking waves. It was built with a heavy iron structure and a lighter hull that were very different from the wooden warships of the past. It was designed without masts to be powered purely by steam, and it has guns that can fire a round every 1.5 minutes. Despite its weaponry and its status as one of the jewels in the Royal Australian Navy fleet, the 220-foot-long warship never left its home port and it never saw action. It did, however, patrol the coast, protecting Melbourne and its rich gold resources from attack. But even though it was an ingenious design that inspired the designs of future surface, gun-armed ships until guided missiles were brought in during the late 1960s, the Cerberus was soon superseded by more advanced technology and construction. By World War I, the ship's status as a warship was revoked, making it a guard ship where munitions were stored, often supplying submarines. But in 1924, the ship was retired and sold for scrap. Of course, this meant its hull was stripped down and resold. Then it was scuttled in Half Moon Bay to serve as a breakwater to protect the coast from devastating waves. Even after being stripped down to nothing, it's still serving its purpose by protecting the coast where it once sailed. There's something poetic, if a bit sad, about that ending to this ship's story, don't you think? Number 3. SS Mahino. In 1905, the SS Mahino was built in Scotland as part of the fleet for the New Zealand Union Steamship Company. The first turbine steamer to cross the Pacific Ocean, the 5,000-ton ship transported passengers between Auckland and Sydney until it was commissioned during World War I into a hospital ship. It served in that capacity until after the war, when it resumed commercial services. In fact, it was actually bought by a Japanese company. As the ship left Sydney in the summer of 1935, bound for Osaka, it ran into a severe cyclone. The tow line from the ferry that had been transporting the ship was severed and without her rudders, which had been removed for towing. The Mahino drifted, washing ashore on Fraser Island's 75-mile beach. In an attempt to save the ship, she was stripped of her bearings, but any attempts to refloat the ships to resume her journey failed. Realizing she was a lost cause, the owner put the ship up for sale, but with no takers. She was left where she sat, abandoned. Between 1856 and 1935, some 23 wrecks have occurred in that area. The SS Mahino, one of the first turbine-driven steamers, is one of the many that have become a landmark attraction around Australia's Fraser Island. Number 2. The YOGN 82. As ships age and decay, governments are finding ways to make these relics of the past useful. In the Fraser Valley, located in Canada, one of the last concrete ships took on a new life when it was slated to become an artificial reef of the Sunshine Coast. Built during the Second World War, the YOGN 82 ship was made with reinforced concrete, along with 9 other American wartime vessels purchased by the Catalyst Paper Mill in the 1960s. They were initially used as a breakwater to protect the mill's log pond. Part of the Powell River seascape for years, the barges were built with concrete because at the time there were steel shortages, which led to the U.S. military ordering a small fleet of ocean-going concrete ships and barges. Constructed in California in 1944, the YOGN 82, which stands for Yard Oiler Gasoline, had no engines. One of 10 ships purchased by the company, the ships remained useful for years, but as mill production decreased, the need for so many ships dropped off too. When the company started working with the local Artificial Reef Society in British Columbia, they came up with the idea to make the ships more environmentally friendly after their inevitable retirement. The plan took shape, and the fate of the ships as an artificial reef was sealed. After finding the perfect spot on the seafloor that could accommodate the massive wreck, the YOGN-82, along with 3 other ships, were prepared, making sure there was no asbestos, lead, or other pollutants left behind before they were loaded with explosives and sunk. Luckily, concrete is one of the best materials for artificial reefs, with animals and other sea life making it their habitat quickly. In the case of YOGN-82, it took about 11 minutes for the ship to sink, and it remained upright all the way to the seafloor. Only half an hour after its sinking, sea urchins had already attached themselves to her deck, and scuba divers can now visit the site to see how the vessel has taken on a new role as something beneficial to the local sea life. Now this is a shipwreck I'd love to check out for myself. How about you? And number 1, the Fathom 5 Marine Park. East of the Bruce Peninsula in the Canadian province of Ontario, the Fathom 5 National Marine Park is home to 20 islands, tons of fish, and more than 20 shipwrecks that are visible from the surface. Known as the shipwreck capital of Canada, the area has some ships that date as far back as the mid-1800s, with some available for snorkeling, diving, and via glass-bottom boat tours. The park gets its name from Shakespeare's famous play, The Tempest, and it is home to Big Tub Lighthouse, built in 1885 and which played an important role guiding ships through the waters of Lake Huron and Georgian Bay. Evidence of the dangers of sailing on the Great Lakes, the shipwrecks lie in narrow channels in shallows that made it a treacherous journey for traders. At the time, schooners with massive masts were bringing supplies to developing lumber towns along the shorelines. Each of the wrecks is a haunting reminder of the recent past, including the 160-foot-long schooner, the Charles P. Minch, which ran aground in 1898 and whose massive rudder is still visible today. An even larger wreck, the W.L. Westmore, is only 32 feet deep, making it popular with divers who want to get up close and personal to get a look at the remaining chains and deck fittings. Submerged near the park's islands, which were formed about 400 million years ago, the wrecks offer a glimpse into the past. Surrounded by imposing cliffs, known as flower pots, these schooners, barges, and steamers are some of the oldest and most well-preserved wrecks in Canada. Number 11. ABYDOS boats. Discovered buried in the sands of Abydos, Egypt, the ABYDOS boats are a fleet of ships that, like other vessels, played an essential role in the lives of ancient societies traveling up the Nile River. They're among just a handful of surviving ancient Egyptian ships. Discovered in 2000, the ABYDOS boats date back an estimated 5,000 years to around 3000 BC. 14 ships have been found at the site so far, where archaeologists believe they were intended for a First Dynasty pharaoh. Measuring 59 to 78.7 feet long and 6.6 to 9.8 feet wide on average, the boats probably had as many as 30 rowers each. Scholars believe that they were functional, but it's unknown whether they were actually used prior to their burial, or if they were built specifically for funerary purposes. Some researchers claim that the ABYDOS boats are the earliest known example of built boats, vessels which were crafted by fitting wooden planks together, rather than assembled with reeds or carved out of logs. Experts speculate that these complex ships were built to reflect the pharaoh's power and wealth. They may have also represented the sun god, Ra's journey in a solar boat through the sky and netherworld. Number 10. Ship 2109. While conducting a routine test in the Gulf of Mexico in 2019, researchers with the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration discovered the wreck of a mid-19th century ship bearing the number 2109 on its rudder. Charred timbers suggest that the 124-foot-long vessel went down in flames, but nobody knows for sure why or when it sank. It's possible that the ship went down decades after it was built, and researchers failed to procure any clues about its crew members, identities, or nationalities. There was also no evidence of the ship's trade. Any useful artifacts for gleaning information, including the crew's personal belongings, may have been destroyed in the fire that seems to have taken down the ominous vessel. The only possible clue about who sailed on the ship, where they were from, and why is the number 2109 in brass on the side of the ship, and so far, it's failed to lead researchers to more details. Do you have any guesses as to who the ship belonged to? Number 9. Batavia. During its maiden voyage from the Netherlands to Java in 1629, a flagship of the Dutch East India Company, called the Batavia wrecked about 50 miles mainland Australia's western coast. Shortly after the Batavia wrecked, its commander, Francisco Pelsart, ventured off in search of food and water, leaving 282 survivors behind on Beacon Island. It took him 3 whole months to return. During Pelsart's absence, a merchant named Jeronimus Cornelius assumed control at Beacon Island, ordering dozens of murders, including of women and children. His reign of terror ended when Pelsart returned and resumed leadership, executing Cornelius and several other mutineers in the process. Several mass graves have been found on Beacon Island, which has since earned the nickname Murder Island. Some of 115 bodies were found buried neatly alongside one another and bore no signs of meeting a violent end. It's likely that they perished from dehydration and that some of them went crazy before they died. Others, including those who were murdered by the mutineers, bore signs of horrific violence, including one man's skull, which was partially lopped off with a sword. Experts are still studying the remains to learn more about the lives of those who perished at Beacon Island. The unspeakable tragedies that occurred here make for a particularly bizarre tale, even to the researchers who have long studied the signs of carnage that were left behind. Number 8. CORPACH Shipwreck. A few miles outside the town of Fort William, Scotland, in the small town of CORPACH, lies the wreck of the MV Dayspring, more commonly known by its nicknames, the CORPACH Shipwreck and the Old Boat of Cowell. It was built as a fishing boat in 1975. It remained in service catching herring and mackerel all the way up until the year 2000. Today, it sits conspicuously in the natural harbor of Cowell Beach, in eerie contrast to the scenic backdrop of towering mountains. The vessel was ripped from her mooring and ran aground during a vicious storm in 2011. She remains where she came to rest, a seemingly ominous reminder of the power of Mother Nature. The CORPACH shipwreck is entirely visible, and during low tide, it's accessible from all sides. Oddly, in 2017, the ship's buoy triggered its distress beacon, prompting a large rescue effort only for emergency workers to realize it was the long-abandoned MV Dayspring. Whether the vessel will ever be removed from the site or repurposed is unclear. What do you think triggered the buoy? Is the ship haunted? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're liking this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe button if you haven't already. Number 7. World Trade Center ship. Construction at the World Trade Center building site ground to a halt in July 2010 when workers found a buried ship just south of Ground Zero. Discovered 22 feet below street level is a pit that eventually became an underground parking garage. The wooden vessel was promptly excavated to avoid damage from air exposure. The ship dates back to around 1773 based on a tree ring analysis, but its identity and history are largely a mystery still to this day. A 2014 study concluded that it was likely made from wood harvested at a small shipyard in Philadelphia, and that the wood came from the same kind of white oak trees that were used in the construction of Independence Hall. This makes sense, as Philadelphia was one of the most important shipbuilding cities in the US at the time. But many questions remain, including whether the ship sank accidentally or if it was deliberately submerged as part of an expansion of the Manhattan coastline. Oysters were found on its hull, suggesting that it sat for some time in the water before becoming part of a landfill. Damage to the vessel's wood from shipworms shows that it likely traveled through the Caribbean at least once. But that's about all experts know, and there's a distinct possibility that they may never narrow down the ship's identity. Number 6. Mystery ship in the Gulf. While conducting a seafloor survey in 2011, the Shell Oil Company noticed something off on its sonar roughly 200 miles off the Gulf Coast. The National Atmospheric and Oceanic Administration investigated the following year and discovered the rotting hull of a copper-plated wooden ship, which experts believe sailed sometime during the early to middle 19th century. Located 4,000 feet below the water's surface, the wreck was investigated by a remotely operated vehicle. Explorations yielded the ship's stove, ceramic plates, glass bottles, muskets, cannons, eyeglasses, and more. The stove is an especially rare artifact, one of just a handful of surviving examples ever found, according to maritime archaeologist Jack Arian from the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management. National Geographic reported that the ship could have been a pirate vessel, a passenger ship, or used for some other purpose. But for now, nobody knows of its identity or origins. Number 5. The Waratah. While sailing in the Indian Ocean from Durban to Cape Town, South Africa in 1909, the steamship SS Waratah and its 211 crew members and passengers vanished without a trace. Nobody has ever discovered the wreck, and there's little evidence pointing towards its fate. According to Live Science, one passenger, who disembarked before the 500-foot-long vessel left Durban, wrote that the ship seemed top-heavy. It is known that the seas were rough the night the Waratah disappeared, and in the following years, bodies and debris were reported throughout the southern hemisphere. Legend has it that the ship encountered rough weather and was capsized by a rogue wave. Numerous other theories abound, including the possibility that the vessel sailed aimlessly into the Antarctic Circle, where its crew and passengers died from cold and starvation. The Waratah's disappearance has been described as one of the most baffling nautical mysteries of all time. Number 4. The Jenny Lind. The Jenny Lind was a small sailing ship that ran aground on a coral reef in the South Pacific and sank in 1850 while traveling from Melbourne to Singapore. There were 28 passengers aboard, including 3 children. Thankfully, everyone survived, and they spend the next 37 days on a quay of sand while building a makeshift vessel from Jenny Lind's wreckage. They then sailed 370 miles to Moreton Bay, near the Australian mainland. A maritime survey showed that the wreck was still visible in 1987, but in 2017, archaeologists concluded that the ocean had destroyed what was left of it, leaving nothing behind. During the expedition, the team discovered and documented 4 other wrecks, which included cannons, anchors, and ballast stones. They believe that the unidentified ship sank before 1850, which is also the time the reef began appearing on navigation charts. Located along a major trade route between Australia and Dutch and French Pacific colonies, the reef was strewn with wrecks as early as 1857, according to one historical record. Jenny Lind's disappearance isn't too surprising, given the area's reputation for powerful tidal currents that are known to ravage what's left of wrecked ships. Speaking with Live Science, archaeologist James Hunter explained that the reef is incredibly dangerous because it's easy not to notice it when it's submerged at high tide, causing some vessels to sail right into it. Researchers hope to identify the shipwrecks that they explored during the 2017 expedition, which would help them learn more about the trading history of the region's early European colonies. Number 3. Indian Ocean's oldest shipwreck. Around 2,000 years ago, a ship sank off the Sri Lankan coast near the modern-day fishing village of Godavaya. The wreck was discovered in 2003, sitting 110 feet below the water's surface. The mass of corroded metal bars was accompanied by glass ingots, pottery, and other ancient cargo. Godavaya was an important port, along with the Silk Road trade route during the 2nd century. Rome had annexed Egypt during the previous century, leading to the expansion of trade between the East and West on the Red Sea, which connects to the Indian Ocean. Until this discovery, researchers lacked actual evidence of the ships that participated in the trade. According to Deborah Carlson, who headed several expeditions to the wreck, she suspects that rough seas may have triggered the vessel's demise, and she believes that it was headed toward Rome. But these suspicions remain unconfirmed to this day. As of 2014, experts were still trying to delineate the exact boundaries of the wreck and hope to retrieve some of it for further investigation. Number 2. The Mary Rose. Commissioned by Henry VIII during the early 16th century, the Mary Rose was a warship of the English Tudor Navy that served for 33 years, despite long-standing rumors that she sank on her maiden voyage. In fact, the ship was used for so long, she was rebuilt in 1536, nearly a decade before she saw her last action. Built with a state-of-the-art design to carry 6 to 8 heavy guns, the Mary Rose was Henry VIII's favorite warship. Throughout her lengthy career, the vessel served in wars against Scotland, France, and Brittany. The ship sank in 1545 after leading an attack on a French invasion fleet, taking all but 35 of her 400 crew members down with her. The incident is shrouded in mystery. According to the Mary Rose Trust, there is only one confirmed eyewitness account of the sinking, which claimed that the Mary Rose was caught in a strong gust of wind while turning after firing all her guns on one side. The vessel flooded and sank, although nobody knows why. Most modern historians believe that the ship was unstable. Perhaps she finally became unseaworthy after decades of service and taking on additional weight. The wreck of the Mary Rose was rediscovered in 1971 and was raised in 1982, with all its guns still loaded, calling into question the eyewitness report of the ship firing all its cannons on one side before sinking. One investigation indicates that the ship was simply altered too much to maintain seaworthiness. Another disputed theory in that the crew was incompetent or ignored orders, leading to the vessel's demise. But the only thing that seems certain about the Mary Rose is that the circumstances surrounding her sinking are as uncertain as ever. And number 1, the SS Palo Alto. Built as a tanker toward the end of World War I, the SS Palo Alto is a concrete ship that never saw combat. She was made with a combination of concrete and steel, known as ferroconcrete, which was cheaper than using steel alone. But the time the vessel was launched in 1919, it was too late for her to serve in the war. In 1929, she was deliberately grounded and used as part of an entertainment complex off the Northern California coast. The repurposed vessel contained a dance floor, a cafe, and a swimming pool. But the company that owned the SS Palo Alto went bankrupt amid the throes of the Great Depression, and rough seas cracked the ship during a winter storm. The state of California bought the ship, and she became a fishing pier. But further weather damage rendered the SS Palo Alto unsafe, and in 1950, she was closed to the public. She was briefly reopened during the 1980s after a short-lived restoration attempt, and again in 2016, but not for long. In 2005, dozens of seabirds were killed by oil that was traced to the ship's cracked and leaking fuel tank. Workers discovered hundreds of dead birds and harbor seals during a subsequent $1.7 million cleanup effort. In early 2017, record-breaking 34-foot storm waves smashed the SS Palo Alto in half. Any lingering hopes of restoring the ship are lost as it sits broken into 4 pieces as a reminder of the harsh waters it calls home. Number 10. The TANGALOOMA Shipwrecks. At first glance, a collection of 15 submerged boats off of the Brisbane, Australia coast resembles some sort of huge maritime crash. But this was no accident. Between 1963 and 1984, the Queensland, Australia government deliberately sunk the old dredging ships near Moortown Island to create a breakwall for small boats. Known as the TANGALOOMA wrecks, they became a haven for reef fish and other marine life, and coral is starting to form in and around the submerged vessels. Over 100 fish species are found at the site, which is also visited by dolphins and dugongs. They love it. The TANGALOOMA wrecks are becoming increasingly popular with snorkelers and scuba divers, as images on social media capture more people's attention than ever before. Situated in crystal clear tropical waters with high visibility, it's an ideal place for underwater exploration. The wrecks are sometimes visible above the water during low tide. Moortown Island is one of the few inhabited islands near Brisbane and is the world's 3rd largest sand island. It lacks paved roads and is a haven for tourists, with the TANGALOOMA wrecks ranking as its top attraction. Would you like to see it for yourself? Number 9. Flamenco Beach Tanks. A collection of rusting, graffiti-covered World War II-era tanks dotting the beach of Puerto Rico's Culebra Island look wildly out of place against the stunning Caribbean backdrop of turquoise water, clear skies, and white sand. But where did they come from? The American military began using Culebra Island in 1901 after Spain ceded Puerto Rico to the U.S. later that year. Then President Theodore Roosevelt allotted the island's public territory to the Navy. When no official base was ever established there, the site was used for bombing and weapons practice for decades. At some point, the Navy tried to evict locals from Culebra Island. They aggressively fought back through peaceful protests against the Navy's occupation of the island. The Navy conceded, and by 1975, the gear left behind, including several large tanks, was the only remaining evidence of a previous American military presence. Even after other items were cleared up, the tanks remained, and they're still there today, deteriorating in the sun and the salty ocean breeze. Number 8. Electric Car Cemetery. An image claiming to feature a vehicle graveyard in France that's filled with dozens of electric cars is currently going viral on social media. A caption on the post states that electric cars get tossed into lots because replacing their batteries is more expensive than replacing the cars themselves. The post also claims that the battery's chemicals saturate the ground, defeating the environmentally friendly concept that the cars are based on. The photo is being circulated mostly by conservatives who debate the concept of climate change. Reuters fact-checked the post, and found out that the cars were not taken off the road for the alleged reason stated in the post. The vehicles were placed in a field after a contract between a local company and local authorities expired. It actually had nothing to do with their batteries. According to Reuters, the retired fleet was used as part of a car-sharing program called AutoLib, which enabled members to use their cars whenever they needed. The program fell deeply into debt as it struggled with booking and parking issues, as well as competition from rideshare companies like Uber. When the contract ended, the company moved its 4,000 cars out of Paris and into a field south of the city. And, contrary to what the social media post claims, the cars are unlikely to sit there forever abandoned. They've been sold to 2 different companies, including one that specializes in reselling cars. Paul Awizari, who heads one of the companies, Atis Production, told Reuters that the cars are stored properly and are not at risk of polluting the soil beneath them because their batteries have been removed. But the rising popularity of electric cars does pose potential problems when it comes to battery disposal and recycling, as The Guardian reported in 2017. Each vehicle contains a half-ton lithium-ion battery, and the question of what to do with them when they're spent remains unanswered. Many lithium-ion batteries are not recycled, and this has environmental consequences, but the answer to this impending crisis remains unknown. Do you know anyone with an electric car? What are they going to do with their battery when it dies? Let us know in the comments below, and if you're liking this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe button if you haven't already. Number 7. Luxury cars. In 2010, car enthusiast websites like Top Speed and AutoGuide reported on the discovery of a Rolls-Royce Phantom sitting alongside a railroad in a Russian suburb. Outfitted with a Rolls-Royce Centurion body kit, the luxurious car looks conspicuously out of place, but it's clear by looking at the image that it had been sitting in place for quite a while. How the $450,000 car got there and why its owner abandoned it is a mystery. The Phantom's ownership was traced back to a buyer in Las Vegas, who then sold it to someone in Russia just a few years before it was found, seemingly left to rot. On top of being mysterious, the deserted Rolls-Royce makes for a sad sight in its worn-out state, covered in snow and sitting next to a woodpile. In most places, an abandoned luxury car is a rarity, but it's a somewhat common phenomenon in some places, including in India and Dubai. The problem was especially bad in Dubai, where an estimated 2,000 to 3,000 high-end vehicles were deserted every year during the global financial crisis that lasted from 2008 to 2010. Outdated laws meant that someone risked a lengthy jail sentence if they fell behind on car payments. Thankfully, the law has changed, but there's still an abundance of leftover vehicles from over the years. Last year, social media influencer Supercar Blondie uploaded shocking footage of a scrapyard filled with hundreds of dust-covered luxury cars in Dubai. Some appeared to have been in crashes, while others had no visible defects. Now that a vehicle owner no longer risks imprisonment by falling behind on their payments, it's likely that fewer people are leaving their cars behind. But in the event that this happens, a car owner has up to 6 months to pay a fine and retrieve their seized vehicle. Otherwise, it will be sold at auction for a much lower price than it's worth. Number 6. Lund Ikrenoplan. Nicknamed the Caspian Sea Monster, the Lund-class Ikrenoplan was a ground-effect vehicle, meaning its wings generated lift and decreased aerodynamic drag while in close proximity to the ground. Designed in 1975, it served for the Soviet and Russian navies between 1987 and sometime during the late 90s. Only one Lund Ikrenoplan was ever fully built, known as the MD-160, and it flew roughly 13 feet above the water's surface. It had a maximum cruising speed of 340 miles per hour and was equipped for anti-surface warfare with 6 missile launchers. Without a chassis, the Caspian Sea Monster was unable to travel on solid ground. Instead, it was stored on a dry floating dock that was built specifically for it. The dock was towed out into the bay and deliberately sunk, leaving the aircraft ready for use. The Ikrenoplan remained self-sufficient for up to 5 days and was the world's heaviest aircraft during its time of service. Today, the MD-160 sits abandoned at a naval base in Kaspiysk, Russia. The only other planned Lund-class Ikrenoplan was never completed. It was intended as a mobile hospital, but a cutoff of military funding left it 90% finished. Number 5. Samratulangi PB-1600. Officials in Myanmar were baffled in 2018 when a nearly 600-foot-long ghost ship appeared in the Gulf of Martaban. A few days after being spotted by fishermen, The vessel ran aground off the country's coast, enabling curious authorities to board and investigate. With no crew or cargo aboard, the only evidence of the ship's origin was the Indonesian flag it flew. 2 cables attached to the freighter's head indicated that it was being towed before it went adrift. The main traffic website provided a few additional clues, including that the ghost ship, named the Samratulangi PB-1600, was built in 2001. Its last recorded location was off the Taiwanese coast in 2009. The Myanmar Navy ultimately determined to a shipbreaking factory in Bangladesh when the crew abandoned it due to rough weather. After finding a tugboat about 50 miles off the country's coast, Navy personnel interviewed the 13 Indonesian crew members who were last aboard the Samratulangi. They reportedly admitted to ditching the ship, and the investigation continued from there. Number 4. 1982 Ford Escort. In September 1991, police discovered an abandoned 1982 Ford Escort in DeKalb County, Alabama. 3 months later, they found the long-dead remains of a young man who had seemingly committed suicide nearby. They revisited the deserted vehicle in hopes of finding some clues and stumbled upon a birth certificate bearing the name Damon Hunter. But authorities soon learned that the document was forged, calling into question the car owner and deceased man's true identity. An investigation determined that someone going by the name of Damon Hunter had bought the Escort in Fargo, North Dakota, the previous month, and that the person stayed in a hotel while there. A threatening note found inside the vehicle indicated that the man had staged a robbery before his death. Police discovered that he had also called a local abbey and pleaded for financial help, telling the monks that he was considering committing a robbery and that the people he owed money to had assaulted him. Nobody at the abbey knew who the man was, though. In fact, to this day, authorities have not identified the deceased individual found near his abandoned Ford Escort. Number 3. Orient Express train. Several years ago, Rotterdam-based photographer Brian Romijan spotted what appeared to be an abandoned Orient Express train in Belgium. He snapped some haunting photos of the old vehicle, which is a mere shadow of what it used to be when it operated as a luxury service a little over a half-century ago. The train has sat in the yard ever since it was taken out of service. Romijan, who discovered it while exploring the area, told the Express that seeing it was like stepping back in time. The Orient Express, originally called Express d'Orient, operated for 133 years, from 1883 to 2009. One of its most famous routes traveled between Istanbul and Paris during the 1930s. Over 75 years later, the final train ride under the Orient Express name ran between Strasbourg, France, and Vienna, Austria. One of the pride of Belgium's national railway, the deserted and decaying train is the last of its kind left. Some speculate that it may not have been an Orient Express train after all, as those routes never passed through Belgium. But the train is impressive in its own right, and it appears as though it could have been completed with the Orient Express in terms of luxury. Number 2. McBarge. Friendship 500, better known as the McBarge, was a floating McDonald's restaurant that was built for the 1986 World Exposition on Transportation and Communication in Vancouver, British Columbia. It became famous not only as a McDonald's on a boat, but for its conveyor belt system that delivered food to the front counter from a hidden kitchen. The McBarge closed for business following the 1986 Expo, and the boat failed to find a permanent home after that. In 1991, the new owners of the site, where it was moored, asked the barge owners to move it. The vessel was relocated to Burrard Inlet, where it sat forgotten for the next decade. It was rediscovered following its appearance in the 2004 film Blade: Trinity. Developers Howard and Kathy Meekin bought the McBarge in 2010 with plans to convert it into the Deep Discovery Center, an imagined deep-sea museum dedicated to the history of the Pacific Ocean. The vision had yet to come to fruition, though. In mid-2020, the Maple Ridge News revealed that the Meekins are still working on restoring the Friendship 500 to its former glory. For them, it's a bucket list item. And at last update, they were searching for the right location for the vessel. The couple has owned the barge for over 10 years now, and their plans for it have apparently changed. Instead of turning it into a museum, they hope to build it into a seafood restaurant. Number 1. MV Lirobov Orlova. Built in Yugoslavia in 1976, the MV Lirobov Orlova was an Antarctic cruise ship that remained in service until 2010. After that, the decommissioned vessel spent 2 years docked in St. John's in the Canadian province of Newfoundland. A company called Neptune International Shipping purchased the derelict ship in 2012 with the intention of breaking it up, but unfortunately, that never happened. While en route to the Dominican Republic to be scrapped in early 2013, the tow line pulling the MV Lyubov Orlova broke, separating it from the tugboat amid rough seas. Crew members tried to reattach the ship, but they were no match against the 10-foot waves and 22-mile-per-hour winds. The vessel eventually drifted back to the waters off eastern Canada, prompting the government to task an offshore supply vessel with regaining control of it. After towing the MV Lyubov Orlova back into international waters, the crew released it back into the open sea. Canadian authorities did not see it as their responsibility to salvage the ship and left the decision up to its owner. Eyewitness accounts of the free-floating ship were later reported off Ireland and Iceland. In early March of 2013, its emergency position indicating radio beacon was detected off the Kerry, Ireland's coast. These signals are only transmitted when the device comes into contact with water, indicating that the MV Lyubov Orlova likely sank somewhere in the Atlantic, but there's a small chance that it's still out there, roaming international waters. Thanks for watching. Which of these abandoned objects or vehicles would you like to find? Let us know in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. See you on the next one.